But we begin tonight with the consequences of insurrection. Because lately, it doesn't seem like there have been many for politicians who participated in them. But there absolutely have been some. Let's start with Couy Griffin, a person you probably don't know. Griffin was the co-founder of Cowboys for Trump and was elected as a commissioner of Otero County, New Mexico. Prior to his election, Griffin was an election-denying, false lies-spreading MAGA Republican. He was so committed to the lie that he was convicted in federal court last year of a misdemeanor for entering the U.S. Capitol grounds on January 6, 2021, without going inside. Griffin was sentenced to 14 days in jail and given credit for time served. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a.k.a. CREW, sued to remove him from office on behalf of New Mexico residents on the grounds that his participation in the January 6th insurrection made him ineligible to hold office under Section 3 of the post-Civil War 14th Amendment to the Constitution. A judge agreed, booting him from his position as commissioner and barring him from holding any public office. Couy Griffin is the only successful case to be brought under Section 3 since 1869. The other modern cases that have been filed but failed were against Marjorie Taylor Greene and ousted North Carolina Republican Congressman Madison Cawthorn. All of that is to say that there has been precedent for these kinds of cases, just not for a president of the United States. And we will find out very soon if the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with the Colorado Supreme Court that Donald Trump is ineligible for office, just like Couy Griffin, because he, too, engaged in insurrection by inciting the riot on January 6th that Griffin and more than 1,000 others got swept up in, and that he did so as a sworn officer of the United States. The Colorado court's decision was clear and unambiguous that Trump incited an insurrection, a point President Biden made yesterday.
Is Trump an insurrectionist, sir?
Well, I think certainly it's self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero. And he seems to be doubling down on about everything.
It will be up to the U.S. Supreme Court to decide, however, which means that Trump's political future rests on John Roberts' court, with its 6-3 conservative supermajority, 3 of them nominated by Trump, and 5 of whom were picked, promoted, and assisted by conservative judicial Svengali Leonard Leo. It is this court, a court whose members have lied to the Senate and the American public by claiming to respect precedent, stare decisis, which they then dismissed and invented arbitrary legal standards to suit their political ideology. That court will now get to determine if Article 3 of the 14th Amendment is explicitly clear when it says, no person shall hold any office, civil or military, under the United States who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution and the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. The debate will most likely center on whether those who drafted the 14th Amendment believed the president and vice president were covered by that language. So these justices just might like to hear what politicians said in response to the lack of specificity on the president and vice president. Here's Representative John Bingham's account of what happened when they brought that up. Quote, "Let me call the senator's attention to the words, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States. Practically speaking, what the authors of Section 3 were saying is that the language was clear and Congress didn't intend for this section to spare the president and the vice president." Now, to be fair, we can't say what the Supreme Court will do. But what I can tell you is that they are deeply unpopular and facing the most profound legitimacy crisis in modern history. And it probably has to do with all the lavish gifts and trips and their fervor for implementing right-wing Republican dogma. And then there was Justice Clarence Thomas, a man who has told clerks that he wants to make liberals' lives miserable. His wife, Virginia Thomas, is an ardent conservative activist who colluded extensively with White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows about overturning Joe Biden's victory over Trump. Now, in case you forgot, Mrs. Thomas sent Meadows 29 text messages in which she militantly and relentlessly demanded that the election results be invalidated because it was a, quote, obvious fraud. She demanded that Meadows release the Kraken and save us from the left taking America down. Ginny's husband will be one of the justices weighing Trump's political future. Clarence Thomas has already participated in 2 cases related to the 2020 election and its aftermath, despite his wife's direct involvement in the so-called Stop the Steal efforts. One of those cases had to do with Trump's White House records being turned over to the House committee investigating the January 6th insurrection. Only one justice disagreed, Clarence Thomas. The Colorado case isn't the only one that they will have to deal with. The court is also currently entertaining the possibility of taking on Trump's claim that he has absolute presidential immunity and cannot be prosecuted for committing crimes. You know, crimes like insurrection. Late this afternoon, his lawyers told the Supreme Court that they shouldn't take up the case just yet, but rather they should wait until the appeals court rules first. Joining me now is Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, who was a member of the House January 6th Select Committee. I'm going to skip for a moment, Congressman Raskin, because I have limited time with you and I want to use it all up. The part about Donald Trump trying to once again delay the Supreme Court hearing a very important case because he wants to slow it down by letting the a sort of interregnum court get it first. But I want to go right to the question of whether or not the framers intended the president to be covered by Section 3. I want to show you a picture. This is Donald Trump taking the oath of office, and you, sir, also taking the oath of office. Here is what the president read. I think that picture is going to come up in a second. When he took his oath of office, Donald Trump recited the following: I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Here's what you and other members of Congress said. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office of which I am about to enter, so help me God. Benny Thompson, who led the January 6th committee, pointed out that language was adjusted after the Civil War to account for the fact that there had been insurrectionists in their midst. In your mind, in your view, as a constitutional scholar and a congressman, did you and Donald Trump both become officers of the United States?
Well, of course. And the Colorado Supreme Court was very clear that both of these oaths of office are oaths to support the Constitution of the United States. And that's the only commonsensical interpretation. And, I believe that the Colorado court did a terrific job of refuting this bizarre claim that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies to every officer in America except for the most important officer in America, the President of the United States. And they demonstrate that the word office or officer is applied to the president or the presidency 25 different times in the Constitution. So I don't think that that poses any serious obstacle to the finding that Donald Trump's conduct was covered by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and that that the provision itself applies to him as the President of the United States.
Is it your assumption? We can't get into the heads, although Samuel Alito thinks he can. You can't get into the heads of the people who wrote parts of the Constitution. But would it be a pragmatic and sort of obvious sort of take to say that they didn't specifically name the president because the president, had been assassinated by the insurrectionists, and I guess they didn't have the sort of creativity to imagine that a president would be the one to be the insurrectionist?
Well, it obviously didn't leap to mind for them with Abraham Lincoln as the central figure in rejecting and resisting the insurrection and the secession against the Union. They had in mind the paradigm case of the president defending the Union against all of the secessionists and insurrectionists. In any event, as the Colorado court points out, the language is comprehensive and exhaustive, and the president has always been treated both as an officer of the Constitution and an officer under the United States. I don't think that this matter needs to detain us much longer. I mean, I think that those people who want to defend Trump against the very clear textual meaning of the Constitution and against the very clear original purposes of it are going to have to gravitate around some other idea. More likely, they will say that Congress needs to act, that this is a so-called non-justiciable political question that belongs in the legislative branch. But I just don't think that dog is going to hunt about how the president is not covered by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. You know, if you go back and look at the legislative history, it's very interesting because the radical Republicans, who were the ones who added this to the Constitution, started off with saying anybody who participated in the Confederacy in insurrection should be disenfranchised forever. And then when it got over to the Senate, they narrowed it down. They said that's far too broad. It shouldn't be anybody who participated in the insurrection. It's just people who swore an oath before and violated the oath. And it shouldn't be disenfranchisement. It shouldn't be about voting. It should be about holding office again. But you can see how Donald Trump's case is right in the bullseye prohibition of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. He is in the worst case scenario of someone who swore an oath to the Constitution, was supposed to uphold it, betrayed the oath, and proved himself essentially untrustworthy and therefore unfitting for office. And that's why this is called the disqualification clause. And it is a very straightforward interpretation of it. I think that when this case goes up to the Supreme Court, it is going to just be a master exam on whether or not the textualists and the originalists really believe in their own rhetoric, because the text is perfectly clear and the original purposes of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment are overwhelmingly obvious here.